education under capitalism. In capitalism, you have for the first time the formation of a labor market. That means you may be here today, you may be hundreds of miles away somewhere else, you may be a skilled labor, you may be an unskilled laborer, whatever, you move around a lot. Capitalism is based on labor mobility. Labor mobility implies the coming into being of a labor market. And if this labor market is to be meaningful, then everybody who's moving around, people who are separated by hundreds of miles, must actually have the same kinds of knowledge, same kinds of skills, same kinds of attitudes. Therefore, capitalism requires education that is homogeneous. It's very important that what is being taught here and what is being taught 500 miles away, 2,000 miles away, or even 6,000 miles away must be identical, in which case a person from here can go tomorrow to the United States and fit into a job there. So the formation of a labor market requires a kind of homogeneity as far as education is concerned. So homogeneity becomes important with the coming into being of capitalism. The point, therefore, I'm trying to make is that the education which is required for nation building and the education that is given or demanded by capitalism are not identical things. Now, in India, in the post-independence period, we have always, no matter what our problems were, no matter what the problems with the education system were, we were always committed to a vision of education for nation building, which showed itself in a number of ways. First, it showed itself in the commitment to the idea of universal education, at least up to a certain level. When, for instance, the Right to Education Act was passed, that Right to Education Act provided that everybody must have the right to education between the ages of 6 and 14. That means that you had universal, and to the government's job to ensure that everybody in that age was actually in a school. Therefore, universalizing education was a part of the requirement of education for nation. The second was, of course, when it comes to curriculum, when it comes to the syllabus. Imagine, for instance, an Indian student who's studying, let's say, economics, which is my subject. Such an Indian student must have some idea of Indian history. How can you understand the Indian economy today unless you know something about the Indian economy in the colonial period, unless you have some idea of the impact of colonialism on the Indian economy? But on the other hand, a person who is studying economics in Harvard or in Cambridge or in Oxford has no idea of colonialism, doesn't have to study colonialism. Therefore, the kind of syllabus which has to be taught here has to be quite different from the kind of syllabus which prevails in foreign universities. And mind you, this is true not only of social sciences. The great British scientist J.D. Bernal was of the view that the kind of science which should be taught in a country like India should not be the same as the science that is taught in a country like Britain or the United States, because the scientific requirements of the Indian society are not identical with the scientific requirements of those societies. Therefore, there has to be a difference in syllabus. Likewise, there has to be inclusiveness, that you have to have everybody, no matter what their economic status, who is covered by education, which is already implicit in the idea of a universal education. But that fundamentally, for instance, a Dalit boy, a person from a tribal background, a person from the OBC background, a person who is economically deprived should not be deprived of education for that particular reason. Because of which we had a number of things. We had, for instance, affirmative action in the form of reservations for specific categories of castes and so on. So we had an inclusiveness which was a part of the vision of education for building a nation. Likewise, for instance, the idea that persons who are getting educated must have an idea of the constitution, must education must impart a commitment to the values on which modern India is based, which are the constitutional values, and an egalitarian society, a society which is secular, a society in which everybody has a set of fundamental rights. Now, all these things must be told to every student, and the student must develop a kind of commitment to the society and the values upon which that society is founded. Additionally, of course, there's the whole question of education providing in your mind a stimulus to question. Now that is very important. That education must make you question things, not accept things uncritically, but to actually question, to develop a scientific temper, and so on. Now these are the hallmarks of an education system which is required for nation building. Sensitivity to others, a commitment to equality, and overcoming of caste and communal divide, and so on. All these are essential for building a nation, since education is a means through which the nation is built. It is important that education must impart these values. But on the other hand, what we find in the current new education policy is that for the first time, earlier education policies, even though they may be saying various things, it is true that actually the quality of education given was no good. It is true that our vision behind the education policy was always violated by the empirical reality of the education system, and so on. All that is true. But nonetheless, there was a commitment to education as a nation building activity. There was a commitment of education in the sense of being inclusive, and in the sense of being egalitarian, in the sense of, not excluding anybody, and inculcating in the students commitment to the values of the Constitution. What we find in the current education policy for the first time is a moving away from the concept of education as a nation building exercise, as a nation building activity, but in fact, specifically looking at education as an activity for the promotion of capitalism. Now, why do I say that? I say that because look at a number of things. First point is that it actually explicitly provides for exclusion. Throughout the document, there is some talk about economically and socially deprived groups, but there is no explicit commitment to caste-based reservations in universities and colleges. There is no mention of it. Okay. Now, I think, given the fact that even in a university like the JNU, caste-based reservation criteria have been violated and flouted, and JNU is directly under the nose of the central government, the fact that the government's commitment to such reservations has got diluted is without a doubt, and the fact that the education policy document doesn't even mention it is a point of some significance. Not only is it the case that, therefore, people would be excluded who come from socially and economically deprived backgrounds because there'd be no reservation, but what is more, you would actually find that because education is all set to become more expensive, many people would simply economically be cut out of it. Why do I say that? because even though the document talks about 6% of GDP being spent on education and so on, that government expenditure devoted to education must rise from 10% to 20%, there is no specific suggestions about how this is going to be actually achieved. In the absence of any specific suggestions of that kind, simply repeating this really does not make much sense. On the other hand, there is talk about, for instance, giving autonomy to colleges and universities, and what is more, financial autonomy as well. Now, autonomous colleges and so on, which are actually therefore have to more or less fend for themselves, would be charging much higher fees. And when they do that, then of course, these exclude large numbers of relatively poor students from socially and economically deprived backgrounds. Therefore, even in terms of the education system that is visualized, there is going to be an exclusion. Thirdly, you actually find that there are large numbers of exit points. That, for instance, you look at university education, after 1 year you can quit. After 2 years you can quit. You get a certificate and you quit. You have a 4-year undergraduate program in colleges, and out of those 4 years, you can quit after first year, you can quit after second year and get a piece of paper. Now it is not a 1-year program that is being offered. It is not a 2-year program that is being offered. It's a 4-year program, and you're simply going to drop out at some point, if you so wish. Therefore, this provides the possibility of people simply dropping out, and when they drop out, they're given a piece of paper, and that piece of paper we call a certificate or we call a diploma and so on. So effectively, therefore, the idea is to visualize a set of people who would be barely educated, who would just have visited a college or a university, but not people who are actually being trained or who are being given a proper course of education. Now, these exit points are basically, somebody may not have joined the university, but somebody joins the university, but then leaves after a year with a piece of paper. So these are, if you like, in the name of flexibility, providing a camouflage, providing a kind of cover for just people dropping out. The fourth is something which you find in the emphasis that is given to vocational studies. There's a lot of talk about vocational studies. Now, of course, it is true that not everybody who receives education should go on to do a PhD or something and become a professor in a university. But on the other hand, everybody must have a minimum level of education. There is a fundamental difference between education and the imparting of skills. Now, when you talk about vocational education, that is actually the imparting of skills that we are talking about. Therefore, a lot of people would now be siphoned off who do not get a proper education but are simply given skills. So effectively, therefore, this is providing for a dropping out from the education system. If you have a democracy in which citizens have a whole lot of responsibilities and rights, then every such citizen must be well informed about the world, because after all, these are people who are going to effectively make decisions about the world. In fact, one of the fundamental assumptions of democracy is that the ordinary man can think about foreign policy of the country and therefore can vote a particular political formation by understanding the issues that include foreign policy. Now, therefore, the presumption behind a democratic society is that everybody must have a minimum level of education to be able to make sense of the political issues that face a particular society. But on the other hand, if you siphon off people for vocational studies very early on, then effectively you are not creating citizens who are fit enough to be part of a democracy. Now, these are various ways in which fundamentally This education policy, while it talks about many things, is actually creating a camouflage, creating a cover behind which people would actually be dropping out, or people are being encouraged to drop out. Some people would continue, others would not. And as I said, since there's a fundamental distinction between education and the formation of skills, this document emphasizes that a large number of people, instead of getting education, should actually be uh, shifted to the skill learning network, the skill formation network. Another point, which again is in the same direction, is that, now we are told that after class 3, after class 8, you are going to have board exams at which students would be sitting. This was never the case earlier. And the idea is that if somebody is not very good, then the person can be encouraged to what is called open learning. Now, this open learning is something which really is, again, a camouflage for non-learning. In Delhi, a very common practice among schools, including government schools, is that students who are not doing too well in these exams are basically sent off to the open learning stream, so that the school can then select a few good students who then go on to pass the board exams, and the school would then claim that, look, what a success rate we have had. Therefore, to generate a high success rate, you're weeding out people from the school system to the open learning system, and the open learning system is really not a serious system of education. Therefore, these are very many different ways in which people are now going to be shifted from the stream of education to the stream, all kinds of other streams like open learning, skill, vocational studies, and so on and so forth. And therefore, this goes against the fundamental idea of inclusiveness, which is essential in an education system for nation building. Now, why do I call it capitalist? Because you see, capitalism, while it insists on providing a homogeneous education, does not insist on providing an inclusive education. But in capitalism, you're familiar with Dickensian England, in which the children were actually doing huge amounts of labor in all kinds of workshops, in sweatshops, but they're not in schools. Capitalism believes in providing education only to that segment of the population whose services it requires. It does not believe in universal education. And therefore, the services of those who are outside of the education system, which is not required for capitalism, are now fundamentally, they are being given a kind of veneer of skills. And you see, skills or vocational education are the following advantage in a society like ours, namely that you have, that let us say there are 100 jobs. 100 people can be employed. But of course, if there are 200 people in the workforce, then the remaining 100 do odd jobs. Suppose the workforce size increases from 200 to 300, then those odd jobs are distributed not among 100 anymore, but among 200. And therefore, the reserve army of labor, what Karl Marx had called the reserve army of labor, that means the number of people who are not really properly employed, the unemployed, underemployed, partially employed, and so on. That is a number whose increase can get camouflaged, can be hidden by the fact that suppose earlier everybody had got 4 days of work during a week. Now, if their size doubles, everybody gets 2 days of work per week. In other words, job rationing can really mean that a large number of people can be given little bits of skills, and simply they share out the jobs that are available. And effectively, therefore, this encouragement of training in certain skills is something which can always be passed off as, look, this is very useful, they're all getting jobs. But effectively, they are what economists call unemployed in disguise. In other words, a given number of jobs. a given number of jobs then simply get parceled out, divided up among more people, not that more jobs are created. This has been happening in the Indian economy, and the current education policy is basically going to prepare for this. And in the process, it is camouflaging the fact that there is going to be an increase